Hello, I am John, and welcome to my corner. For the past 6 seasons, college football has determined a champion through the College Football Playoff. In the FBS, there are 10 conferences, the Power 5, and the Group of 5, with the Power 5 being generally superior to the Group of 5 by consensus. So far, no Group of 5 team has participated in the playoff, and only once has a Group of 5 team finished in the top 10 of the Playoff Selection Committee's rankings. That was Central Florida in 2018, finishing 8th, which is 4 spots behind the final playoff spot. Over the 6 years of the playoff so far, there have been 3 Group of 5 teams to go undefeated, every time missing the playoff, and every time with the downfall in their resume being clear, having a weak strength of schedule. So if a Group of 5 team is ever going to make the playoff, we know it will have to face a stronger schedule than we've seen so far. So today I'm asking the question, how strong can a Group of 5 team's schedule plausibly get? But before that, a quick disclaimer. The following is a very, very rough way of answering the question I'm setting out to answer here. I'm not a statistician. I make a lot of assumptions in this analysis, and the results are miles from being significant. But as a sports and spreadsheet nerd, I thought this would be pretty fun. So here you go. I get into the ways this could be improved later on in the video, but if you do have thoughts or suggestions, I would love to hear them. Okay, back to the corner. All right, so throughout the video, I'm going to use some cumulative data, mostly averages. These will be based on the past 6 seasons because that's the time the playoff has been in place so far, and because there have been very minimal changes in conference realignment over that time period. So we're not working with a huge data set here, but we do know that all the data we're working with is relevant to the question since these were from years in which there has been a playoff under the current format. Now, for my strength of schedule ratings, I will be using this simple formula with opponent's record being a win percentage value based on the combined win-loss record of all of a team's opponents within a single season. Likewise, opponent's records is a win percentage based on total wins and losses of the opponents of your opponent. The record of a team's direct opponents gets weighted more heavily than that of their opponents, and then these two values get totaled together to give us our overall strength of schedule value. So this on its own doesn't really tell us a whole lot, but by doing this for every FBS team in a given year, we can compare teams to one another to see whose schedules are the strongest and whose are the weakest, getting a 1 through 132 ranking. So in order to project the highest plausible strength of schedule for a Group of 5 team, we need to roughly project its regular season opponents and their records. But in order to do that, we have to have an idea of the team's schedule, which varies based on conference. So we need to decide which Group of 5 conference our strength of schedule Frankenstein will be coming from. The most obvious choice here is the American Athletic Conference. It has the strongest reputation of the Group of 5 generally. It inherited a number of teams, and under the old system, an automatic BCS bowl bid from the former Big East, which is a conference that was maybe arguably on par with those that are now the Power 5. It's also the conference that has gotten closest to a bid so far, again with UCF in 2018, and second closest with UCF in 2017. So it's pretty clear why you would sort of preliminarily assume that the American would be the choice here. And in this case, the numbers do back that up. In the college football playoff era, the American has had the highest average record, the highest average opponent winning percentage, and the strongest showing against Power 5 teams of all of the Group of 5 conferences. The Mountain West is a pretty strong second here, but it's pretty clear that in the Group of 5, the American is the big man on campus. So we need to project the strongest plausible schedule for an AAC team, and more specifically for an undefeated American champion, as there's virtually no way a Group of 5 team is going to be seriously considered for the playoff without being undefeated and without winning its conference. So what will this team's schedule look like? Now, conveniently, the way the schedule works in the American is pretty straightforward. There are no divisions, there are no special annual matchups, there aren't any weird 4-year home-and-home cycles to deal with. Just every team playing 4 non-conference games and then 8 conference games, and the teams with the 2 best records in the conference play each other in the championship game. So our conference champion will play all but 2 of the other teams in the American, again without dependence on divisions, and we'll end up playing a rematch against the second best team in the American in the AAC championship game. For the non-conference schedule, we will be pretty generous. To start off, our group of 5 behemoth will be scheduling all Power 5 teams for its non-conference opponents, which in and of itself is already pushing the boundaries of plausibility. We'll say they get one, really splashy marquee win, like for example, Houston upsetting Oklahoma in 2016. They'll get another win versus a pretty strong team, one that's above average in the Power 5, not quite top tier, and then we'll say their other 2 teams are decent Power 5 teams hovering around 500. So overall, their non-conference opponents will look like this. For the conference opponents, I approached it by looking at the cumulative data for the conference so far through the CFP era. Now, if I were doing this in a vacuum, I would probably up the numbers a bit here on the assumption that the conference as a whole is going to be abnormally strong in this particular year. However, I'm not going to do that right now. I will explain later why that is. So, the conference has a 550 winning percentage overall over the past 6 seasons, which equates to a 74-60 cumulative record over a normal season split among 11 teams. That corresponds to a 29-15 non-conference record, which also lines up with the conference's cumulative 648 non-conference winning percentage, again over the past 6 years. So, a cumulative conference record of 74-60 it is. All we need to do now is distribute that among all of our American teams and finalize the schedule. First of all, our People's Champ will get 13 of those wins. Likewise, we're going to be generous and say that the People's Runner-Up will go 11-2, winning all of their other games while losing to the conference champion both in the regular season and in the championship game. On the other end of the spectrum, given that each team plays 8 conference opponents, there are going to be 2 teams that don't get the honor of losing to our golden boy. Instead, these 2 teams will make the honorable sacrifice of being absolutely terrible in the name of strength of schedule. So there'll be a combined 1-23, with the 1 win coming from when they play each other, which they will have to do under the Americans' current scheduling format. Now, this is a bit of a stretch. I mean, this would require that both of these teams lose all of their non-conference games, which could happen, but is pretty unlikely given that most FBS teams in that position typically play an FCS opponent, if not also other pretty weak FBS teams. In the American, for example, the closest we've come to having this happen in the past 6 years has been in 2015, and in that year, UCF went 0-12, losing to FCS Furman by a single point that year, and SMU went 2-10, also losing a very close game to a JMU team, which is a very good JMU team, also an FCS opponent. And of course, in this year, UCF and SMU didn't actually play against each other. So that would have been, in theory, 1 extra win among the 2 of them. But if you recall from earlier, I didn't give the conference any boost above the average when considering its overall record. And I think this other assumption sort of balances that out. The conference could have an up year, or it could have some notably bad teams that just so happen to not play the eventual conference champion that year. But I think it's a bit of a tough sell that both of those things would happen in the same year at such a pronounced level. So I'm keeping the overall conference record at the average, but I'm completely maxing out the strength of the conference opponents that are being taken into account playing against our champion here. So I figure those balance out to a pretty generous prediction without delving really far into the realm of something that's virtually impossible. So we shove as many losses as we can on our poor sacrificial bottom feeders. And now distributing the rest of the wins and losses becomes a zero-sum game, so let's just do it like this. If we now return to our original strength of schedule formula, we have now a fully projected opponent's record. The only thing we still need is the opponent's records, which I'm definitely not going to try to predict in quite so much detail. I'm just one guy. So instead, I simply looked back at the data from prior years, found the average opponent win percentage based on conference. This is a little hand wavy, but this portion of the strength of schedule is weighted less heavily anyway, and I don't quite have the time for a more precise prediction, so whatever. So our group of 5 representative is playing all Power 5 opponents in its non-conference schedule. Let's say they're all from different conferences, so we just have a single team from 4 of the 5 among our opponents. Sorry, Pac-12, East Coast bias strikes again. Now we drop in the opponent records for an average team from each of these conferences, like so, and the rest is just the average for an American team, again and again, giving an average opponent's record for each of our opponents for our champion of this, which gives us a final strength of schedule value of 1.815. Okay, great, but what does that mean in terms of actually useful data? Well, strength of schedule rating of 1.815 would be in the top 10 for strength of schedule all of the previous 6 years using our method. So that's pretty strong. It's probably too strong, to be honest. That's a plausible season if everything goes perfectly. But let's have a look at that schedule again. Putting some real-world faces onto this non-conference schedule, that would be roughly equivalent to beating Kentucky, Miami, Oklahoma State, and Penn State last year, with the loss to our group of 5 team replacing one of the other losses for all of these teams except Kentucky. And while I can absolutely see a team getting all of those wins, frankly, for a very good American team, only 2 of those would even maybe be categorized as upsets. But all of those happening in a single year is shaky at best. So let's go back in and, let's say reasonableize the schedule. Our champion isn't going to schedule an FCS opponent in the non-conference still, but it's also not going to schedule all Power 5 opponents. Let's say instead they have 2 Power 5 wins, one that's a slightly weaker statement win than we had before, over a team that's in the chase to make its conference championship, but maybe doesn't quite make it, and the other over a more middle-of-the-pack team. And then the other 2 non-conference games are going to be against other group of 5 teams. We'll say one of those is relatively weak, the other is about as strong of a win as you can find from within the group of 5. The reasonableized conference schedule is going to be mostly comparable to the original conference schedule we were using, except I'm not going to be doing the same maximizing technique earlier where I just dumped all the losses among the weakest teams. Instead, I'm just going to distribute the wins and losses a little more evenly, make sure that the overall win percentage for the entire conference lines up with the conference average. I'll still be decently generous with the opponent's record. I'll use the strongest corresponding conferences for all of the non-conference opponents, which are these. And this would lead to a schedule strength of 1.707. So this is weaker than under our more aggressive assumptions, but this still puts us roughly in the 20s to low 30s, depending on the year over the past 6 years. That's still pretty strong for a strength of schedule ranking, honestly. It's not weak enough to consistently be prohibitive of any undefeated group of 5 champion, like our theoretical one, from making the playoff. So long as we feel okay about the assumptions we've made, that's it then. The best a group of 5 team could do in a stretch is top 10 strength of schedule ratings, which is definitely going to be good enough to make the playoff. In a more realistic year, albeit one with still a pretty strong team, the strength of schedule will probably be in the mid-20s, which is going to be still very respectable. But there's still one problem. The rating formula I showed earlier, remember that? The one that didn't have any sort of justification or any vetting? Yeah.
It's a piece of crap. It doesn't work.
This is not what the playoff committee, or apparently anybody else anymore, uses to calculate strength of schedule. This is what the BCS used as of 2008. Well, technically they use this, but there's no relative difference since all I'm doing is removing a factor of 1/3. So while calculating the strength of schedule this way is not without historical precedent, this is not how the college football playoff does it. In fact, through a bit of digging, I found out that the CFP gets all of the statistics that the committee members use from this company, Sports Source Analytics. And as you might expect, their method of calculating this is not publicly available. It's not up on their website. I also emailed them and didn't get any response. So this is still a bit of a black box as to how the real strength of schedule ratings are calculated. I did go through and compare the results from our formula to results that we do know that were released from previous years to check the error between our method and the real method. So indications are based on some of the testimonials available on Sports Source Analytics' website that ESPN also uses them as a source, at least when it comes to their publicly available ratings for the college football playoff. And comparing our results calculated for previous years to those from ESPN shows mixed success at best. This graph, for example, plots the difference between my ratings and that of ESPN by team for the 2014 season. So if it matched exactly, the columns would all be at 0. You wouldn't see anything on the graph. But as is, there are a bunch that are very high throughout this whole thing. And there's no real discernible pattern to how they're distributed. The average difference is over 16, with a pretty substantial fluctuation above and below that. So there's really no way for our rating system to be close enough to give us any useful information about the real system that the CFP is going to be using. If anyone watching this has a suggestion for a strength of schedule model that better matches that of the playoff, I'd love to hear about it. Or, if you know how the college football playoff itself actually does get its ratings, hit me up. And maybe weigh in about whether you think a top 10 strength of schedule, like our very flawed model, would even be feasible for a group of 5 team to obtain in the best of years. All right, so that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. The idea for this was in part inspired by an episode of the podcast that I do with my brother Adam, where we talked all about the group of 5. So you can check that out at the link. Otherwise, stay tuned for more like this and have a good one.